I don't wanna be the boy that runs in the back. I don't wanna be the kid that falls in the dark. All I really want to be is the guy that gets that girl.
Welcome to the AJ Steele Show. We discuss politics, sex, money, and everything in between. And now, here's your host, an immigrant, a self-made millionaire, an American, AJ Steele.
Everything I say and do, I'm just not good enough for you.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the AJ Steele Show. I wanted to open this episode with a question. How would you feel if a white Republican was voted in as president and immediately stated that the only people he would ever consider for his cabinet and Supreme Court appointments would be white males? How would the media react? What would your gut tell you? Well, just the other day, a Democrat president, Joe Biden, said that the only person he would ever consider to be a Supreme Court nominee would be a black woman. You may remember that he did the same thing with picking his vice president, and we all know how well that worked out. So how did America react to his racist picks? The lapdog media reacted with delight. They didn't raise a single concern. But what did our gut tell us? Well, most Americans couldn't care less. Their gut and their brains have been preconditioned to accept the fact that it's okay to discriminate against white people. But what about black males? What about Asians, Jews, Hispanics, Hawaiians, Native Americans, and just about everybody else? Is it okay to discriminate against them? Joe Biden wasn't just being a racist to white males. He was being racist to every individual in America who is qualified to sit on a Supreme Court and doesn't happen to be a black woman. I've been telling you for many years that America is not a racist nation, and that my personal success is proof of that. I've also said to you that I don't think that most people in this nation harbor racist feelings towards one another. I believe that the globalist billionaires who happen to belong to many different racial groups are the ones creating all this cultural strife in order to cover for their tyranny and greed. America has never been about color. It's always been about big business and money. And the sooner we understand that, the sooner we realize that we're being played by these heartless globalists, the sooner we will know that we're all in this same thing together as Americans. Divide and conquer always worked for emperors and kings. And sadly, it still works today for the folks that run this world. But some of us aren't buying it anymore. Which leads us to today's very special guest. I find it fascinating, or maybe it's by divine providence, that we got to interview Ward Connerly a day after Joe Biden once again showed his racist face to the whole world. Mr. Connerly is an American treasure and someone whose career I've been following ever since my early 20s. He is the president of the American Civil Rights Institute and a proud black man who fought our government for many decades, basically telling them, enough with affirmative action and enough with all these humiliating handouts to black people. His achievements are numerous. He is the author of the first California anti-discrimination law, which passed in 1995. And believe it or not, he also defeated Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, and Kamala Harris when they tried to repeal this law in the 2020 election. He's responsible for many other state ballot victories all over the country, court wins, 3 books, and the respect of millions of thankful Americans. And yet, despite all the accolades and honors, he's a very humble man who truly believes in the goodness of America. Yes, he's been on Tucker, and yes, he's been on the Ben Shapiro show, and yes, he has had the ear of some of the world's most powerful people. But today he's all ours. And the truth he told me made me fear for our future. And yet, strangely, his struggle also gave me hope. His struggle as a black man is the struggle of every man who dares to think for himself and stands tall in the face of arrows and slings. His struggle is the struggle of America in the 21st century, to remain a beacon of freedom, equal opportunity, and hope. Before we get to our interview, I'd like to ask all of our wonderful listeners to please tell their friends and family about our show, and to please remind them to subscribe and listen. We here at the AJ Steele Show are very grateful for your friendship and for your listenership. We will be right back with Mr. Ward Connerly. This is a very important interview you don't want to miss.
All I really want to be is the guy that gets that girl.
The AJ Steele Show. Think of your loudmouth best friend, hated by all the wives, because he tells it just like it is.
Finally see your love belongs to me.
Hi, Mr. Connerly. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you on our show. I've followed your career for many years, and I always thought that you were not only a trailblazer, but also a very principled and in many ways a fearless man. Along the way, you were called a race trader, an Uncle Tom, and a house Negro, and many other things that we will cover very shortly. But before we go there, I wanted you to tell our listeners about your background. Where were you born? What kind of world were you born into?
AJ, I was born in Leesville, Louisiana in 1939, which was a Jim Crow state, obviously. And on my birth certificate, I never forget that it had a C on it. And that C was not the children's ward or Connerly, it was colored. And as a colored child, my future was pretty well determined by my government when they placed that C on my birth certificate. We were a very segregated society, but worse than just the mere segregation, and that's bad enough, was the thinking behind that C. That thinking was a presumption of inferiority. And the darker your skin color, in our society, the less worthy you were, the less able you were to participate in society. You shouldn't be drinking from the same water fountains as white people. You shouldn't be marrying any whites. There were laws, explicit laws, against interracial marriage. You lived in a certain neighborhood. You went to a certain school. If you wanted to have a hamburger at the local restaurant, assuming they would let you in, then there were sections of the restaurant set aside for colored. If you had to use the bathroom, there were restrooms there that were set aside for people based on color. So it was a terrible period. Terrible thinking that our country inflicted on people during that period of our history.
America was a very different country then. How did you end up in the San Francisco Bay Area?
Well, I really didn't end up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I ended up in Sacramento. And my mother died when I was 4. And I was turned over to a committee of 3, my maternal grandmother, my Aunt Bert, my mother's sister, and Aunt Bert's husband, Uncle James, who was like a father to me, a surrogate father, because my mother and father had divorced when I was 2.
Oh.
And Uncle James was part of that black migration from the South during that period. And he went to Washington State, Bremerton, to work at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. And my grandmother dispatched me to live with Aunt Bert and Uncle James. And we lived in Washington for 2 years. And then Uncle James headed to California.
What a fascinating story you have. Now, I live in a place called Marin County, which is about 10 minutes north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And there's lots of shipyards all around the West Coast. There's one next to us in Sausalito. There's another one north of us in Vallejo. And then south of us in San Francisco, there's a place called Hunters Point. And a lot of blacks migrated here during the war for better jobs, and they built the ships that won World War II. Now, I have a difficult question to ask you. In a perfect world, we would all be judged on our merit and not by our skin color. But to be fair, America wasn't always that great as far as those things were concerned, especially not in those days. We didn't always follow those lofty ideals. Did you personally have to deal with racism from white America or even from black America?
Well, I've received my share of discriminatory conduct. I've had probably in the last 25 years more hostility directed my way by my fellow black people because of their belief that I am betraying them by the stances that I've taken. But that's changing, AJ. I see a rebranding that's occurring among black people. We're learning, I think, that to be free means to think for yourself. It means to subject yourself to the same competition that you expect of other people. Black people are very competitive. You see that competition in sports. We have an attitude that we are on top of the world and everything except matters of the mind. And that's why I've opposed affirmative action, because it really is debilitating. It doesn't cause young black kids to aspire to be great in mind matters, but rather in sports. I don't think that's where the future is for any group of people to lock yourself into. But I've had more misery directed my way because of black people than I have anybody else.
That's just unbelievable, but I've seen it in other minority communities as well. It seems like instead of building each other up, they tear each other down when they disagree. Now, it seems to me in many ways that you're still being attacked by racists, except for now they're disguised as liberals. When I was doing research for this show, I read your Wikipedia biography page, and it stated that you're married to a European descent woman. I've never seen an entry like that ever for anyone. It's ridiculous. It's almost like these lefties consider you a criminal because you married a white woman. I thought we got past that many, many years ago.
Well, I had one of the worst experiences I've had in my 26 years of public life was an interaction I had with then State Senator Diane Watson. And she said publicly during a legislative hearing in the California Senate that he doesn't want to be black. He wants to be white. He married a white woman. And I lost it. I just said, you're a racist. You're a bigot. You're a lightweight. And I don't like to deal with people that way. But that bespoke of a level of racist thinking that was terrible in my view. Here black people are supposedly fighting for individual rights, fighting for the right to be a full human being, and yet here you have a legislator who happened to be black exercising really racist thinking. And I will never forget that experience. And I will never forget my abject failure to maintain my composure.
Well, we're all human and we don't want to be abused. And there's no reason you should have been abused for it. And she's a very ugly person. Now, I wanted to ask you some questions about the 60s, if you don't mind. I'm a great admirer of Martin Luther King Jr. And I recently even finished a biography of his called Let the Trumpet Sound, which my oldest daughter sent me for my birthday. Believe it or not, I even took my kids to visit the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was murdered, because I wanted them to understand. Now, you were a young man in the 60s. You lived that era. Were you one of the guys that followed him, or did you idolize more radical folks like Malcolm X or the Black Panthers?
Great question. I followed Dr. King. I was a strong believer in his way. He was graceful, almost elegant in the way he positioned black people to fight for their right, their birthright. But in the fullness of time, I've come to appreciate what Malcolm X was saying. And the contest of that period was between Dr. King and Malcolm X. One wanted to demand that we be given our full rights. The other was saying, you take it. Don't place any faith in what white liberals are going to do for you, Malcolm said. Do it for yourself. And I sort of, along with others, assumed that he was arguing for separatism. And I just don't have any affinity at all for separating people on the basis of skin color and what we call race. But I've later come to appreciate the need for independence, self-independence, the need for self-empowerment that is so afflicting so many black people.
Well, Malcolm X was a very interesting character. He had a very serious transformation, and he probably ended up paying with his life for that transformation. And if I was a young black man living in the 60s, I might have followed him too. In other words, I see his point also. Good people were tired of waiting. They were tired of being abused. And maybe to someone younger, Malcolm X was very appealing because he wasn't weak. He wasn't benign. He represented strength. But when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, we learned that Dr. King was almost like a saint. He was bigger than life. And yet today, all these arrogant lefties, including a good majority of the so-called black professor intelligentsia types, they seem to think that Martin Luther King is passé. They say that he was too soft and naive and way too accommodating to the white man. What do you think caused this shift against him? Why the new narrative?
I think it's progressive ideology. If you were to look at the things that happened to Larry Elder as he ran for to be the successor to Governor Newsom. Yes. There were things that were directed at him that were clearly racist, and they were coming from white progressives. Mm-hmm. And I sort of was asking myself, why is he being subjected to this kind of thinking? If this was a black man who happened to be a Democrat, they would have been all over that campaign and supporting him. And yet they were bringing him down and calling him the black face of white supremacy, something that I've been accused of. I just think that when there is no longer a problem, it's the nature of politics that you create one. And that's what's happened we're no longer supporting equal rights. Civil rights, in the minds of many of those who have been associated with that for years, really isn't about equality in their mind. It's about uplifting and advancing colored people, black people. And that's a lesson that we didn't learn. And I have tried to be true to that belief that we're all individuals. We're all created by a creator, and we all have individual rights. We're unique individuals, but we still have equal rights and equal opportunity to compete. And if you believe that, then you don't perpetuate the kind of racist thinking that came from that state senator, that came from this white progressive that attacked Larry during that campaign. Individual rights are the centerpiece of our founding.
You're listening to the AJ Steele Show, where no topic is off limits, no discussion too harsh, no truth more true. The AJ Steele Show, we tell it like it is.
All I really want to be is a guy that gets a girl. All I really want to be.
What you're saying is so very true, and yet my mind keeps racing back to Malcolm X, and I wasn't prepared to talk about him today. But he warned us. He told us that the liberals are the most dangerous of all racists. Because we know what racists feel, they tell it to us. But the liberals play their nice games. They're so kind. They're so thoughtful. They're so free-thinking, and they pretend to be friends. And yet, they might be the worst racist of them all. Malcolm was very prescient, wasn't he? But having said all that, I actually have a very serious question that challenges a lot of the things that you're saying. How do you counter the argument that disadvantaged minorities don't get a fair chance precisely because of our history of slavery and racism? Statistically, many of them do seem to be behind the curve when it comes to education and good jobs.
It's so true, AJ, but it's not because society is prohibiting it. They're not James Meredith, who has to fight his way into the University of Mississippi. There is more opportunity now than you could imagine. It's almost as if black people are the preferred race and that people are intent upon helping us. And therein lies part of our problem today, because that help for individuals based on race sets back everybody else because of the perception that we didn't get there on the basis of our own agency, but rather on the basis of the gift from the government, gift from white people. And you still have people languishing in the inner city, not seizing the moment, not taking advantage of the opportunities that are before them.
What I've seen in my life, and it's not just for black people, it's for all people, is when you get assistance from the government or any other organization, you become very lazy, you become complacent, and even worse, you become dependent. And I think it's been done on purpose. I do realize, and I agree with you, that certain minorities are given preferential treatment, and it's the definition of racism. But between us, I don't think it's helping them in any way. I think they're still picking cotton, literally picking cotton, but this time it's for the Democrats. That's my impression. Now, you fought against affirmative action for most of your adult life, and you had significant success in multiple ballots all over the country. And the most recent one is Proposition 16, which you opposed and defeated in the year 2020. We beat it in a liberal state that voted for Biden by a huge margin. I want to know, first of all, what made you start fighting affirmative action? And the second question would be, why did liberal California come out against affirmative action at such a large margin?
Well, I fought it because implicit in what affirmative action has become is the notion that one society is racist to the core. And that's not going to change. Those who believe in affirmative action will state. And we have to overcome that by these policies. I'll never forget a meeting that I had with President Clinton and Al Gore in the Oval Office after 2009 had passed. And I was invited to the White House. And Al Gore said to me as I was leaving the White House that I was wrong and that we are by nature prone to discriminate against people, and the government had to be there to protect us and to make sure that we got into these positions that we otherwise would not get into. And it really reinforced in my mind that there is really evil that lurks in thinking of many of those who support affirmative action. And I've seen it, AJ, and up close and personal in my fight against race preferences. And I go out of my way to make sure that people understand it is race preferences. I'm not opposing the government helping low-income people or helping people who are disabled, but I'm opposed to giving a preference to A over B solely because of A's skin color, or not even solely, strike that word, because they fudge by saying, well, that wasn't the only reason. I just think that should be off the table. How I was born should have nothing to do with how I'm treated by my government or by my society. And that is the vision to which I aspire.
Well, what Al Gore was telling you in his genteel, rich person's way was his belief that blacks are inferior. Not to mention the fact that in his belief, the black man cannot succeed without the white man's help. Now, I do seem to recall that Al Gore's family comes from Tennessee and that many of them were in the tobacco business for many, many years. I'm not sure if they owned slaves, but they definitely had that rich, white, old world superiority mentality, and obviously it continued down the line to Al Gore himself. Now, as far as all the hard work you've been doing, fighting affirmative action in courts, fighting it through elections, and actually winning, unfortunately, it seems to me that despite all of these votes and court decisions, the liberals keep marching on with their plans, which are completely illegal, yet they march on undeterred. Do you get that impression as well?
Yeah, I do. It's not the liberals, quote, so much as it is the progressives. The battle of our time is between the progressives and the traditionalists. Progressives, by definition, are constantly changing things. Traditionalists believe that their version, their view of society is one that will never change, while progressives are always in search of the new model, something that's better than what we have now. But unfortunately, what they view as better turns out to be infinitely worse than what we had before. And with the progressives, among their progressive priorities is race. If you want to transform America, as Senator Sanders used as his rallying cry, you have to deal with race. And I think people like Dr. King disagreed. You don't need to transform America with respect to ideology. just have the country live out, as Dr. King said, the true meaning of its creed. And that is that all men are created equal. Capital M, men, which thereby includes women and everything else that's a human critter, should be treated as an equal. And by equal, that means equal opportunity.
AJ Steele. Not right, not left, just right.
You're talking about equal opportunity, not equal results, correct?
There are going to be unequal results based on our readiness, based on our competitive spirit, the fact that there are 9 guys out of 10 running up and down the basketball court who happen to be black is not because we're discriminating in favor of black people. It's because black people, and I am one, would go out during the summer and practice dribbling up and down the court and doing layups and trying to dunk. And I have a twisted finger right now because I tried to dunk and got caught in a metal net when I was about 14 or 15 years old. And,
wow.
It's because you practice. And what I've been preaching is apply that competitive instinct, that discipline, that desire to overcome, we shall overcome. Apply that to matters of the mind. Apply it to those things that are marketable in America in the year 2022 or whatever the year happened to have been.
So how do we deal with an incompetent senile president in 2022 who clearly picks an incompetent woman as his running mate for the simple fact that she is black and a woman? And not to mention the fact that just the other day he said that he will only consider a black woman nominee to the Supreme Court. What happened to picking the best person for the job? What happened to equal opportunity for all of us?
President Biden ran for president 3 times. He struck out the first time. He struck out the second time. He was almost on the verge of striking out the third time when a black congressman saved him by endorsing him and giving life to his campaign. That was Congressman Clyburn. And he is now enslaved to the progressive ideology. He said it's long overdue to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court. Well, it's long overdue that any Asian would be appointed. If you're going to use that as your criteria, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth about the Supreme Court appointment. And he knows, I think, that this is going to be viewed as an appointment strictly on the basis of race, because that's what it is. He appointed our vice president as his running mate. He selected her because of race, because he wanted to appeal to the progressives. He has made this commitment to be the most progressive president in American history. I will never forget that pledge of his, and that is what convinced me that he was not the man for the job, and I could understand why former President Obama was so reticent to endorse him. I could understand why the Democrats had rejected him on 2 prior occasions. He is now trying to have it both ways. He knows that this is going to be viewed not as the most capable person, but rather one that was predetermined by his campaign.
Well, I think we can talk about Sotomayor as well in the same vein, but let me move on a little bit. What are your thoughts on the new voting rights bill? Do you know any single American of any race who followed the rules and wasn't allowed to vote in 2020?
No, I don't. No, I don't. And I think that is your comment, your question is indicative of the problem. This voting rights bill is a political solution in search of a problem. And they want to reform the electoral process when there's no need for it. There's a need to get back to same-day voting, which we abandoned because of COVID, as I understood it. But they want to, they meaning the leadership of the Congress, they want to change everything. This is progressive ideology at play. Pray that Senator Manchin stays the course and we don't allow this to happen.
Well, Senator Manchin and Sinema as well. She kind of impressed me lately. I'd like to ask you a question about the great Satan and famous racist Donald Trump. So we all know that black people and minorities in general had record low unemployment. We know that the economy was roaring for all of us. And we know that upward mobility wasn't just an idea, but it became a fact. But as usual, blacks voted in huge numbers for Biden and the Democrats. There's two traditional groups that vote Democratic no matter what happens. It's the Jews and the blacks. I gave up on liberal Jews because it seems that they're so married to the Democrats that they'll vote for them no matter what anti-Semitic leaders they field and how much they hate Israel. But I'm not so sure about blacks. Is there a chance that they will ever wake up and vote for their own best interests?
I think there's a chance. I really do. I think that things are happening right now. There is a rebranding, as I put it, that's going on. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be large numbers of people initially. But as you look around at the internet, social media, you look at various things, you can see a lot of slippage of black people moving away from the Democrat Party. And the belief that Republicans are the province of rich white people who do nothing but play golf and tennis is dissipating. And as a result, black people will slowly recognize that free at last, as Dr. King said, means exercising the freedom to think for yourself and to look at the facts and make decisions about who you will support to be the president, or any political decision on the basis of what's right and what's good for you as a person, regardless of your skin color, and not to be enslaved to the Democrat ideology, evidenced by candidate Biden when he said, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't black."
Wow.
We have to break away from that and recognize that we are independent, we are free, and we have the opportunity to cast our votes based on what we think is best, not to be led around by the likes of Joe Biden.
All I really want to be is the guy that gets that girl.
The AJ Steele Show. Think of your loudmouth best friend, hated by all the wives, because he tells it just like it is.
Finally see your love belongs to me.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not a Republican myself. I am a conservative, and I think that Trump brought out the populism in the Republican Party, and all of those backroom Republicans, the country club rich guys, the globalists, they kind of scurried and hid for a while, but they're still there. Those rhinos are still there, and they're working hand in hand with most of the Democrats. Now, the older I get, the more I realize that the globalists, and to me it's more globalists than progressives. I think the globalists control the whole deal. And I'm not making any kind of racial distinctions, I hope you understand. But I believe that there is a cabal of very wealthy people that just want to get wealthier. And we've seen it over the last couple of years with this COVID. But I feel that the globalists treat black Americans and other minorities as useful idiots. They pay lip service to them before every election. And once they get the power, they forget about them. But there's plenty of black shakedown artists like Jesse Jackson, Louis Farrakhan, Al Sharpton, heck, the entire leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. And these people make millions trafficking in hatred and victimhood. What kind of thoughts do you have about these so-called civil rights leaders?
Well, I sadly came to the conclusion when I was involved with Prop 209 that black people really didn't care about equal rights. Black people, just the leaders, the so-called leaders, Reverend Jackson and Al Sharpton, were more concerned about enhancing their own stature among black people and being the leaders, the self-appointed leaders of black people, rather than professing interest in equal rights, equal treatment for all people. I caught a lot of abuse because of my attachment to people of Asian descent who were clearly being discriminated against. And I argued then, and I argue now, and I always will, that if you really believe in civil rights, and that that is a right that belongs to all of us as individuals, then it shouldn't be controversial for me to rise to the defense of a white male or an Asian woman if there is discrimination and they're not being given the same equality of opportunity as black people are. But the black intelligentsia of that period did not agree with me, and right now probably still don't agree with me. I still get names directed my way. Just this week I was called Coon Connerly by a black woman. So there's still a lot of that nonsense. But I think that slowly it will wash away as black people look at the facts. President Trump had some excellent policies, but he really needed to reconsider his whole approach to politics. He saw politics, and still does, I think, as a form of entertainment. And to get elected, he was the great pretender. But once elected, he governed very soundly. His policies made a lot of sense. And were it not for the peculiarities of his campaign style, he would still be sitting in the Oval Office. But because of those idiosyncrasies that he inflicted on himself, the voters were left with making a choice between style over substance. And they went with the style of candidate Joe Biden over the substance of Donald J. Trump. And they rejected the substance because they did not like the style. And I believe that that is something that, should he run again, and I believe he will, he's going to have to confront that. And if he still wallows in the notion that the election was stolen, he risks a similar outcome to 2020.
Interesting. Now, I don't have personal proof of the election being stolen, even though I suspect it was. But I think we must acknowledge that the old media, the new media, social media, all the powers that be colluded together to destroy him in an illegal way, or at least in an unethical way, and that tipped the scales. And I agree with you about his persona, the bigger-than-life persona, but I also think that's the reason he beat Hillary in the first place. So yes, I agree with you. He's a faulty human being, and there's no question about it. We are all faulty human beings. But you're right. He governed as a very reasonable conservative, and he did a lot of great things. And I think a great injustice was done to him on a personal level. But that's neither here nor there.
So let me address that, because I think you're right about that. From the moment that guy announced he had a target on his back, and the whole establishment, elected officials who said, "How dare you play in our sandbox?" The entertainment industry, and the athletes who would ordinarily visit the White House when they won the World Series or whatever, they boycotted it. They threw mud all over the guy, and he received some very shabby treatment, some of which was visited upon himself by that persona, but he received some very shabby treatment.
I didn't live through the Nixon era, but from being a student of history, I think he took a lot of slings and arrows as well. When the media doesn't like you, they will do everything they can to destroy you. And that's what they did to Nixon, and that's what they did with Trump. I don't doubt that Nixon was crooked, but I don't think he was any more crooked than a Bill Clinton or a George W. Bush or a Barack Obama or a Joe Biden, for that matter. You and I could probably talk about this for hours, but unfortunately our time is running short. So I'm going to have to ask you our final questions, and the first one being, where do you see America headed? Are you still hopeful, or do you feel that we've already lost the war?
I am very fearful that we've lost. I have always believed that now more so than ever, that society has to have a moral structure, and there have to be guardrails. Without a moral structure, without guardrails, it's like saying on the freeway, disregard the lanes, disregard those white lines there, drive wherever you want, drive on the side if you want, do whatever you want. That's where we are in our society, and I don't know how we turn this around. When I was growing up, we fought Jim Crow because we knew that there was a moral vision. We knew that the nation had a creed, and whites and blacks and Native Americans, Latinos and Asians all joined together to get us to the point that we were at, which is that everybody should be treated as an equal. And as you said, AJ, Prop 16 was defeated by a margin of 57 to 43, when in fact Prop 209 passed by 55 to 45. So this more diverse society reaffirmed the commitment, the belief in individual rights than they did 25 years earlier. And so that was uplifting. What got us to this point was the fact that there was a moral structure. And as a black man, a black person, I was convinced at church that we shall overcome the obstacles that are placed in our path. As long as we're graceful as long as we argue and protest peacefully and just tell the American people what they're doing to us is wrong, we shall overcome. That was the song the theme song of the civil rights movement. And we don't have that now. There is no Martin Luther King or Billy Graham or anyone else on the political stage that has the ability to command our attention and point us in the right direction. Therefore, I am fearful about where we're headed, where we are, and our ability to turn it around.
Mr. Connerly, I am not a deeply religious man, but the older I get and the more I see, I realize that religion is the thread that kept America together. It gave us morality, gave us a feeling of community, it gave us something to believe in, and it gave us a reason and a purpose to live an ethical life. And through the efforts of our media and government and teachers and college professors and all the brilliant people out there, we've managed to minimize God. We've taken God out of our lives, and in many ways, we lost our way as a nation.
In the absence of a creator, what do we call upon as a moral beacon? What do we use? I don't know.
Yeah, we're trapped in nihilism and selfishness and anarchy, basically.
Exactly.
My final question for you, and thank you so much for sitting with us, is do you have any new books or projects that our listeners might be interested in?
I do. I'm writing my third book, the working title of which is Ward's Words, From Jim Crow to Diversity on the Natural. And it will chronicle, and I'm halfway into it, it will chronicle where we started and where we are and how we get from here, hopefully, to a better place. Because I believe we're in real trouble as a nation, as a society.
I don't disagree, and I hope a lot of people buy your book, and hopefully we'll talk again when you come out with it. We'd love to speak to you again. Mr. Connerly, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the AJ Steele Show. I wish you good health and continued success.
AJ, it's my pleasure. You asked some great questions, and I appreciate it and value the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All I really want to be is a guy that gets the girl. All I really want to be. All I really want to be is a guy that gets the girl.
The AJ Steele Show. Copyrighted 2022.